Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, it is our pleasure to welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Yehudah Pryce. Yehudah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Of course, and thank you for making time on Erev Shabbat. I know in these winter months, the sun sets at 4:30, so it's always tough. So we talked. You were actually one of my first podcast guests 2 years ago. I'm going to link to that original episode. We talked about your background, how you sort of found Judaism in prison. So I want to just, we don't really need to start with the background. There are a couple questions that I actually have lingering from that episode 2 years ago that I've wanted to ask, and then we'll sort of naturally gravitate towards more contemporary issues, Judaism, antisemitism, racism, that intersection. I noticed in an article that either you had written or was written about you a couple months ago that you talked about the anti-Semitism that you experienced in prison once you started identifying as Jewish. And I'm wondering if you can sort of walk us through what was that like, in prison, because your identity literally changed from somebody who wasn't Jewish to Jewish. So you were really able to see anti-Semitism, from zero to, wherever it ended up. So I'm curious if you can just start there.
Okay. Good question. So first of all, I would like to say anti-Semitism wasn't rampant amongst everybody. It happened when it happened, but it definitely was felt. Inside prison, it's hyper racialized politically, meaning everybody's organized based on what their skin color is, essentially, or what sort of ethnic background they have. So people automatically in their head, I don't think people have a good understanding what it means to be a Jew or what that is all about. Most people, which included me at one point, experienced the Jewish people or Judaism through the lens of other people. If I was going to put my anti-racist hat on, I don't think anybody has really decolonized or deconstructed anti-Semitism from the normal sort of cultural norms or whatever that's been embedded throughout history and whatever culture they come from, to really even conceptualize what does anti-Semitism mean, what is a Jew, or anything of that. So inside prison, they just assume because they see me with a kippah, with the yarmulke on my head, that, I was trying to identify as the people they identify as being white. I don't know if I mentioned this in your other podcast. I always have a problem when people try to graft America's color-coded social constructs onto Jewish identity, because Jewish identity preceded even white supremacy, right? And so, but again, they imagined that I was trying to be white or trying to identify with some sort of white ideology, and they had some pejorative views over what Judaism was, or what Judaism was in their mind, as it was connected to these so-called white people that they thought. And so many times they would say these people are not going to accept you, or you're trying to be like them. They told me when I got out of prison I wouldn't be accepted. It was mostly, that came from my own. I was part of the black car. That's what we called it, like vroom, vroom. That's what it was called. Other races wouldn't say that, not because other races were like less anti-Semitic or just more cordial, generally speaking, is that between races, unless there was a war, unless there was something going on like that, there's like a racial war going on in prison, people were super polite between races, right? Because they didn't want to be the person that started a whole issue. So they were more polite than I see. Skinheads have been nicer to me in general conversations in prison than some people that I know out here in the free world. I say that also with the sort of caveat, I've been in war and they have tried to stab me before and all that. So I'm not trying to, I don't want to say whitewash skinhead sort of behaviors in prison, but just trying to give you a better picture of what it was like.
So where did that put you? Because I'm imagining, the skinhead, group in prison, they probably also weren't loving the fact that there was, that you were Jewish, right? So I feel like, even what you said about Jewish identity before, the irony of Jewish identity, which you of course know, but just to spell out for the listeners, is if being white is a good thing, Jews are not white. And if being white is a bad thing, Jews are white. And so I can imagine you as, a person of color deciding, becoming Jewish, all of a sudden that pits you at the negatives of really every group. So I'm curious, did you sort of find yourself without a group or without a community, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I always had to, I guess, identify with the black card, because that's just what it was. And this wasn't like a formal declaration or a formal commitment. It's just what you were grouped by, and that's just how you navigated reality inside there. So when I started acting. Yeah, I said going down the path of this Jewish journey of mine, it separated me, but more so because of the function of what like Jewish law does. So I couldn't share in meals with everybody. I was doing kosher meals, right? When people may have like Friday night activities or Saturday, games or whatever they're playing, that I couldn't participate in because I was identifying as somebody going down this Jewish path. So that separated me more than anything. But then also, as the rabbi in prison, Rabbi Lon Moskowitz, would say, Judaism is about behavioral modification. So I was also not necessarily beholden to the norms, which are hyper masculinity and being super confrontational. Uh, I was very mindful of how I spoke. Right, I didn't want to use explicit language. I believed morality and ethics were still incumbent on us, even if we were in a state of legal oppression, right? That's what prison is. It's a legal form of oppression, but I believe we had sort of moral autonomy and we couldn't use that as an excuse not to act like menches, so to speak. And so all these things kind of put together that kind of separated me. I was separated by appearance, by just food behaviors that usually, food brings people together. And this sort of normal sort of socializing that separated me more than anything.
So let's talk about, sort of navigating to contemporary issues. I want to talk about anti-Semitism and racism, or anti-Semitism in the Jewish community, or sorry, anti-Semitism in the Black community, racism in the Jewish community. The last 60 years of Jewish African American relations have been very confusing. I'll just say as an observer, right? I mean, I think, in the Jewish community, and I'll just talk about my own vantage point, and then I would love to hear your thoughts. I sort of grew up with two conflicting models. One was, the Heschel model, marching with, Martin Luther King Jr. And, the Jewish community talks about, the Jewish being at the forefront of the civil rights movement. On the other hand, starting in the 1960s and then certainly going till now, you have a type of, I'm reminded of James Baldwin's famous essay in the New York Times about anti-Semitism in the Black community. I'll link to this for listeners. And there's also been a type of anti-Semitism in the Black community that, again, kind of what you were talking about before, attacks Jews because Jews are sort of hyper white. And I'm curious, if you can kind of talk about these competing impulses in terms of, how the wider Black community sees Jews. Are they a natural ally? Are they confused about who Jews are? And you can sort of take that question however.
Take that question, however. All right, let me jump into that question, however I do. So I think in the 60s we had a sort of rise in militancy. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Brought that up. He didn't let it go by, saying, when you're saying Zionist or Zionism, you're really talking about Jews, and it's anti-Semitism is what I'm hearing. You could dress it up as whatever your noble cause or whatever righteous cause you're fighting for, but it's clearly anti-Semitism. As far as like relations go, again, I think there's a misunderstanding what it is. What is a Jew? What does it mean to be Jewish and all that? I also think there are many in the Black community, at least, that identify as being the original Jews, right? So it's hard to hold that we are the original Jews, and then you have people that look nothing like us claiming to be Jews, and actually like having like robust, communal life. And connecting to that in a real way that's visible, and you have people that identify as being the real Jews, so to speak, not necessarily doing all that, but still claiming to be authentic in that matter. So I think naturally that sort of it creates the conundrum. Who's the real Jew? Are they fake? Are they taking it? And if you add the Christianity, the sort of Christian anti-Semitism, if we're interpreting Revelations, and you are the fake Jews, and that's where they're getting some of this language from. It's not just, it didn't come up out the blue. It makes it, especially if you're not having ongoing relationships between the communities, it makes it easy to go in that direction and having some sort of animosity or some sort of tension, generally speaking. Now, I say all that with also the backdrop. We kind of know about the Soviet propaganda that started in the 60s that really tried to exacerbate this sort of tension. They were all for the sort of Zionism as racism within the UN, and they were working hard towards that. So we had also had that stuff going on as well. And I think it all just added up to continuing tension. And then, like with anything, if you're not having like regular interactions with another people, right, it's easier to engage in hatred. It's easier to engage in a separation, not a separation as in you're just doing you, I'm doing me, but a separation because we have an issue with the other people. But I think fundamentally, it's a misunderstanding to what is a Jew, what is Judaism, and for sure, it's a misunderstanding of what anti-Semitism is because I don't think people understand what it is. And I could just to highlight that point, I just finished my doctorate where the framework for the whole program was DPAR, diversity, equity, inclusivity, intersectionality, anti-racism, and power analysis. And I posed this question to so many of my, my colleagues, other students, professors. Can you give me an accurate definition of what anti-Semitism is? And it was a struggle to conceptualize it, right? It was a real struggle to conceptualize it, which boggles the mind because if we're thinking about anti-racism, right? Which also anti-hatred, that I don't think it's a social construct we're talking about anyway, right? But for you to be an anti-racist and not understand what it is, and then also just to throw another thing on top of that, the fact that it should be relevant. It might not be relevant to a banker or somebody in real estate. Not that it shouldn't be, but I'm just saying, like in the social work, for social workers, it should be relevant for anti-racist social workers. But the fact is that Jews are the number one victims of hate crime in America per capita. Not only there's no allyship, there's not even a drive to understand those sort of dynamics. And that sometimes I'm at a loss for words, but it's an ongoing problem.
I wrote down like 6 different bullet points that I wanted to touch on. There's so much there. Let's go back to what you were sort of alluding to the idea of Christian supersessionism, which just for listeners that might not be familiar, starting around already with Paul 1900 years ago, this idea that Christians are the new Jews or the new Israel, and sort of the old Jews or what we would call today Jews are sort of shackled by this idea of the law that the New Testament came to abolish. And this has sort of been an ongoing Christian motif in the wider Christian world for 2000 years. This idea, one of the modern evolutions of this idea is now in the form of what one might call the Black Hebrew Israelites. They're a very opaque group. In other words, it's very hard to figure out any information about who they are. Obviously, you have people like Louis Farrakhan who just depending on the year make bigger splashes in the media than others. But if you can sort of talk, I mean, how much of this is rooted in Christianity? How much of this is rooted in just confusion of Jewish identity? I mean, just to drill down a little bit more. And, I remember, my dad grew up in Brooklyn in the 60s and 70s. And then, even to this day now, you have this, phenomenon that goes underreported of, Hasidic Jews. Brooklyn has a huge, Chabad population, and other areas of New York have, big Hasidic, Satmar and other populations, of just getting, randomly attacked and punched in the face, generally by, younger Black men. And it's always been a little bit confusing because, if we know anything about, Hasidic Jews, especially Hasidic Jews in New York, I mean, they don't mean any harm to anyone, if we're going to fault them, it might be for being a little bit too, keeping to themselves, but, they're definitely not going out, at least I don't think, and sort of antagonizing. Yet you sort of had this, even stories from my dad growing up in Brooklyn in the 60s and 70s, it sort of seems like it's the same thing. So I'm wondering, I mean, one, what is at the root of this phenomenon? And then, I don't know if you have any solutions.
Uh, okay, so you touched on a couple things. Let me see. So I can't speak to what the root of it is, right? I do believe, like, if we were talking about deconstructing sort of uh backgrounds, culture, and the historical perspective, you'll see that for a lot of Blacks in America, Christianity was a default religion, transatlantic slavery and Christianity. So those sort of motifs, those sort of what a view of a Jew is, and maybe inherent anti-Semitism, at least on a cursory read of Christian texts, and especially those passages, you are the your father is the devil, or stuff like that, right? That just, to me, if I read it, I'd be like, anti-Semitism, right? And so I could imagine that plays out in the understanding of what Jews now are in America, or who they are, versus, if you, I need to have, I have empathy for the situation that we're talking about, of people who had their culture taken from them, an identity taken from them. As a Jew connected to an unbroken chain of tradition, right? An unbroken chain of tradition, I could only imagine like what happens when you just steal a person's whole identity, right? Their whole culture and replace it with bits and pieces or scraps, right? Because there wasn't a full equality, so they got a version of Christianity as well, right? What does that do to the psyche? Like, what is the lasting impact? Has anybody tried to deconstruct it and work through? Has there been a general push for people to understand who Jews are and what Judaism is? What is that tradition? I mean, even when I explain it, I'm not so. I don't care if it doesn't really matter if they know about religious practices and rituals, right? I think a lot of times when people are trying to, hey, this is what Jews are about and the rituals, that goes beyond it. I think if we could understand, because it's peoplehood, it's deeper than religion, right? Because you could be born Jewish and be an atheist, you're 100% Jewish, right? That's a hard concept, right? That kind of discombobulates people a lot of times. But if we could understand it as, and this is how I usually make breakthroughs, and maybe this is a question to what we can do about it when I'm talking to people, is that Jewish people have an identity, which in part is religious, that was formed and created essentially in Eretz Yisrael, right, in the land of Israel, and this indigenous culture and tradition was passed down meticulously from generation to generation. The fact that everything that I practice right now, everything that I teach my children, I can trace it to a learned elder a decade ago, decades ago, centuries ago, thousands of years ago, right? That's a different sort of, you can't come from the conspiracy theories and disconnecting us from the land and all sorts of other sort of racist tropes that are used. If you kind of know that history, right? That history is like undisputed the way we can track it because we can actually name people from every sense of era. When I have conversations like that with people, right? The idea kind of like, okay, the Jewish people are an extension of that. That makes sense. Oh, when there was a base of Mikdash, when there was a temple, 10% of the Roman population was Jewish already there. Then we had the Bar Kokhba revolt and exile through Rome, right? And so we see all that, but people don't understand that history. And what's happening is they're looking in our scriptures and transvaluing passages. I see it all the time. So I've had many discussions, debates, whatever you want to call it, with Hebrew Israelites in prison. Like I was a Jewish chapel clerk. I was also the Islamic chapel clerk. I was the interfaith chapel clerk. So I've had robust conversations, and I've heard a lot of these conspiracy theories. And I think at the end of the day, if we're not having those sort of conversations for people to know, right? And it's also who you bring to this conversation, right? Because people might be like, this guy doesn't know what he's. Somebody comes to you. If I bring you to somebody in prison, they're going to shut you down, right? They don't even want to hear. Like, all right, just look at this white guy, right? It doesn't mean what you're saying is not, it could be more substantive than anything I could possibly say. But the point is, like, we see ourselves in others, and when you're faced with oppression, right, you're even more wary of other things like that. But when we have these sort of conversations across the color line, so to speak, I don't like to use the word color because Jews come in all hues, but if we're talking about black versus not black, but in contrast to Jews, I think we failed to do that and present Jews that could better connect with people in these spaces when these conversations are going on. So it continues this sort of dichotomy, right? Oh, it's white Jew, so to speak. I don't believe in that term. I just want to keep on the listeners keep on saying, let the listeners keep on knowing that I don't believe in that term, but nonetheless, right? People can look at, oh, white Jew speaks to real black Jew, right? Or again, how they're kind of imagining it, right? And so I think we've lost a lot of good opportunities in that. If you want to ask, how do we change it? I think there's a lot of Jewish leadership that could use a splash of our diversity in these sort of conversations. And it doesn't happen, right? And I think we miss a lot of great opportunities by not doing that. Because at the end of the day, the only real way to end hatred, if we're not talking about any sort of metaphysical way, is proximity, right? It's harder to hate people you're familiar with. Proximity in a real way, not just two communities living side by side, totally separate, but proximity in, like I tell people all the time, oh, how many black people you at your table, right? Or how many this, you can't want better relations unless you actually have relationships. Do you understand, like, deep relationships, not relationships that only form in the context of civil rights discussions or allyship in a particular movement? Because then again, it comes off as, I'm not saying this is like fully articulated or conceptualized in everybody's head, but it comes off as we have interactions when it's a form of charity, right? Form of tzedakah, yes, we're fighting for the good thing. We've been doing that, right? Jews have been at the forefront of civil rights, black civil rights, right? You whether talking about the Urban League, the NAACP, and in real ways, right? They called Martin Luther King. People used to call them the freedom hats when they seen all these kippahs and people being locked up for it. So we're that motive, that sort of motivation, and that sort of that drive to help others, for sure. It's a real thing. It's a Jewish value and should continue, right? But I think there needs to be normative relations between both communities.
Do you think that's at odds with, there's been so many debates in, politics for the last couple of years about, you know, both DEI programs, but even more fundamentally, this fixation on identity as opposed to just saying, I'm going to be, either gender blind or color blind, even if we all recognize that's probably not actually possible. I'm curious where you come down on this specifically, you're at the intersection of a multiplicity of communities, the sort of DEI infrastructure. And then there's also sort of an anti-Semitism problem there that I want to ask you about in a few minutes, but just focusing on, general progress in America for where we might want to be in 10 years. Do you see a bigger fixation on race as sort of, an essentialized feature being better for these conversations and sort of leading with that? Or would you rather see relations more organically? Or do you think that that's just not possible given, the history of America?
Yeah, the history of America, it's a certain social milieu out here that dictates things that might be different in other sort of places. Here, since we're not like a homogenous society, we're really a country built on different sort of groups, right? And now we're trying to work together to make this American dream work. I believe Coleman Hughes, I think, articulates this well, and which is just an extension of him articulating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is the idea of blindness as a value. Because at the end of the day, if you were creating a society from scratch, would you want people to be judged based on their content or the character, or would it based on skin color or some other thing? It doesn't mean that we have to be oblivious to people's struggles that may have occurred based on their identity. I'm definitely not saying that, but that's not the whole picture, and that's not the totality of and it shouldn't be the totality that we're aiming for, right? You can't say that you want a fair society and you're going to create it by doing unfair things. I've never heard, at least my parents never told me two wrongs make a right, like but that's what we're attempting. I could give you a deeper criticism of critical theories. I have an issue with that, and that was part of, I had to take a critical race theory class for my doctorate degree with professors that were claiming to be experts in critical race theory. I think it's a racist theory, if you want to ask me. Ultimately, it sprung from it's a Marxist theory. It comes from a Marxist sort of grouping of critical theories, and it's intent on bringing down structures of society. If Jews are doing well in those societies, it naturally means Jews are, especially for the tenets of critical theory, right? That Jews are part of those power structures, are aligned with those power structures in the way that they are furthering oppression of others, right? So the mere setup of the theory leads to the sort of dynamics we have right now. But I wouldn't say it's the theory alone, because anti-Semitism, as we know, occurred before that theory, right? And it occurred, and it always morphs and changes. So we already know, like, generally speaking, that whatever society has the biggest issue with, the Jews are to blame for it, right? Right now, it's race, it's supposed colonialism. I say supposed because people do not mention the imperialism, colonialism all throughout the Middle East that has been done in such a thorough way that we don't even talk about lands being colonized anymore. Not only that, people will sit from undisputable colonized lands in America and point fingers and critique about other things, right? But again, it's a supposed bad thing right now, so Jews are to blame for that. You had some other questions within that questions, but I want to make sure I touch on those as well.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, we can obviously talk about this for, 10 hours, and I probably, me and the listeners wouldn't get bored. It's one of those things, Zionism and the Jewish return to Israel is one of these things that always bugs me in terms of the progressive movement seems to have missed a perfect opportunity to talk about this being a decolonization movement. I mean, if you want an example of a people that were kicked out of a homeland and return after thousands of years to be a model for indigenous peoples everywhere, I mean, Zionism is the most successful case study of that working. And, even similar to what we were talking about in terms of critical race theories and power structure. I mean, if you want to talk about one of the top examples of a people in the 20th century going from zero power to attaining some power, what better case study than the Jews? But this is sort of, I've been trying to wrap my mind around, the sort of wider critical theory. I connect DEI to it. It doesn't seem like you do. So I want to ask you about that in a minute. But this idea of, well, if power is always bad, then, what's sort of the goal? Because obviously, if the goal is to uplift some people, do you just uplift them until then they get power and then you knock them down? Because it seems like that's what happened to Jews in the last, 70 years of the West in, very confusing ways. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I also wanted to just throw out, so I've been, railing against, the wider DEI institution for the last year, especially after October 7th. It just seems like whenever there's more emphasis on DEI, anti-Semitism follows. But I wanted to ask you about that because you mentioned before that you were involved in some, diversity projects. So, I mean, is it possible to sort of, suction out the anti-Semitism and then still have a DEI type program that doesn't, is anti-Semitism a bug or is it a feature of a lot of these programs?
Okay, that's a deep question. There's probably different parts of that deserves a discussion in itself. So first of all, even if going by DEI tenets, and I'll throw in anti-racism as a or orientation connected to that, if you're not trying to deconstruct anti-Semitism from all these other sort of cultures and societies and systems, right? I think it's baked into the cake. DEI is not causing it. It's a way to channel anti-Semitism. It's the way that anti-Semitism is manifests. It's a way that it does, but I think it exists in society. I think you mentioned about Zionism being a successful decolonization movement. You know what happens when you have discussions with these people on college campuses, which is why I think administrations need to just call them racist and kick them out of school. Sorry to be harsh, but they will say, right? Because I don't get into Netanyahu's government. I don't get into what this state looks like, supposed apartheid or any of like that, right? Because I think these are all just ways to justify anti-Semitism, right? I'm gonna pick up on this, right? I break it down to: do the Jewish people have a right to self-determination in their indigenous homeland, right? And right there with that question, that you'll be able to draw out the anti-Semitism, right? Many times people say those aren't the real Jews. Those are not the same Jews. You know how many people on college campuses I heard say that? As if they can somehow create some sort of DNA skin color test that determines what it means to be Jewish and have a connection to that land, right? They argue with Jews being indigenous, period, right? That's why they say JC is a Palestinian, right? Everybody would be like, "What? You're just like that's cultural misappropriation. You're stealing somebody's identity and then ascribing it to somebody else that didn't even exist back then, right?" Not only that, like the mere use of trying to define what Zionism is in a pejorative way, right? When you take another people's words and ideas and try to make it so they lose voice in the process, that's an act of anti-Semitism. When you try to only bring Jewish voices to spaces that will agree with you, the vast very minority of Jews who typically don't participate in any sort of normative Jewish communal spaces, yet you uplift their voices as speaking for the Jewish people. That's an act of tokenism, is an act of racism, right? It is an act of anti-Semitism in this particular case. So I think it boils down to that part, right? Do the Jewish people have a right to self-determination? Notice I didn't say what that self-determination looks like, just that mere fact. Because at the end of the day, when I look at the Palestinian Authority's position or Hamas position, that's what it boils down to, and it says it in their constitution and their writings. When I look at the Hamas charter, the founding charter, and in one line it says the Zionists or Zionism, and the next thing it quotes an almost 1,400-year-old text to kill Jews as a religious duty, right? They conflate it themselves, and not only that, to people who claim to be against imperialism and colonialism, in that same charter, it details how their ideology conquered the whole region and it's their land in perpetuity from that subjugation. The mere fact that you can see them conflating Zionism with the Jewish people and using an anti-Semitic text, right? you got to unpack that, really got to deconstruct that using that, right? And at the same time, omitting and bragging and saying they are an extension of this imperialism, and nobody says anything about it. Like I said, I believe there isn't some anti-Semitism that needs to be worked out, and I think the DEI just provides perfect cover for that, since you could judge a situation by who has power or who's doing bad, and or who's doing better than others, and saying that's a bad guy versus a good guy. That's Marxism, this repackage, right? Instead of classes, we're repackage it in group identity. And what happens when this group has more power than other power? It's a power grab.
And it's so shocking because these are obviously some of the best educated people in human history. They're also some of the most, conscientious people. I've been, hanging around on a college campus for, too many years at this point. And, I remember when, I haven't heard this phrase for a while, but it used to be, microaggression was the term that everybody was obsessed with. You can't say anything that might imply that you're saying, so obviously, racism, is saying something, very explicit, but you can't even say, if you see somebody that doesn't look like they're from America, oh, hey, where are your parents from? You have an interesting accent, right? Like that's a big no-no because we're super conscious. And, I think for a whole variety of reasons, the sort of fixation on microaggression also hurts, natural, friendship and organic relations, because I've actually had numerous students tell me over the years that they are too afraid to engage with people that look differently than them because they don't want to offend them. I mean,
Yeah.
this might be shocking to listeners, but I've, and it's the saddest thing because they'll say, and this can be any identity, a person of color, somebody who's trans, somebody of a different religious background, I feel uncomfortable. What if I say something offensive? And I'm like,
Yeah.
how sad is this? We're too afraid to, make friends and have conversation but to put that aside, when it comes to microaggressions, we have this, the progressives have this hyper attenuation to anything that smacks of, something that might offend somebody if they take it the wrong way. Yet when it comes to anti-Semitism, it just seems like some of these theories are so explicitly anti-Semitic and, far beyond microaggressions, and sort of, it's some mix of, protocols of elders of Zion with, Jewish blood libel conspiracies mixed with, Jews controlling the media, what is this? Is this just, is anti-Semitism just sort of, a universal baked in feature, from some, there's one of my favorite midrashim, just for listeners, pieces of rabbinic literature, comments on, Har Sinai, sounds a lot like the word Sinah or Sinat in Hebrew. It's spelled differently, but the rabbis, interpret, why is it called Har Sinai? And they say, from there is where Sinat came from, hatred. And so the rabbis are sort of, envisioning anti-Semitism as, this is just some universal feature of, from the legacy of the Jewish people. But, from your vantage point, because you probably get to have a lot of these conversations that I don't get to have, is this just a big misunderstanding? Do you think people really are anti-Semitic at their core? I mean, what is responsible for the best educated people probably in world history, perpetuating this?
There was a lot of smart people in Germany, right, during Hitler's reign, right? So one, I think anti-Semitism is an illogical. It might, I have the DSM-5. I don't think they listed in there, but if I was writing the DSM-5, I might put it in there because I see people just like get possessed by this particular idea and just act out in weird ways where I'm just like, what's going on here? So yeah, I think if we just think about the origin of Western culture and other sort of societies, about the anti-Semitism that's been baked in as they've been formed, right? You have to deconstruct and unpack that. I believe you do. Two, I say people don't understand. I go back to people don't know what it is to be a Jew. Well, they don't know Judaism. They don't know our connection to Eretz Israel. They don't know what it is, right? And so when you don't know what something is, yet you see people doing well, and I don't just mean like material well, but like having robust communal structures and things going in place, right? You wonder. I think that plays a part too. And then also though, I think it's not just DEI. I put more, I bring that up because DEI claims to be about belonging. That's the only reason if you claim, just like if you claim to be anti-racist, yet I see people happen to be more racist within a moment, I'm gonna be like, that doesn't fit well. I mean, we could break it down like this, right? Because people are blaming the situation in Israel now, right? Which is the craziest thing, that the Jews, an act of genocide was carried against the Jews, and even before there was like a true Jewish response by the state of Israel, there was already protests and already like against Jews, right? Again, anti-Semitism skyrocketed, right? It was the craziest thing that a genocide against Jews happens, and after that, around the world, anti-Semitism starts to rise, right? That should let you know that it's a world phenomenon. It's not just a isolated sort of a situation. And I challenge, and I've challenged this, and I October post October 7th, the reaction didn't necessarily surprise me. Right. I mean, for a lot of Jews, I think it was like our Dreyfus affair. Like oh, we can
Mm.
just assimilate. America's the best place, or this place. Then you turn around and say, oh, wow, a lot of my neighbors don't like me, right? For no other reason because I'm Jewish. But if you look at it, and I challenge the people in DEI, social justice, social workers, all that, right? How come there hasn't been any significant allyship with Jews and they're the number one victims of hate crime in America per capita, right? That alone tells you it's not based on this war. It's not based on the war. People need to stop pretending like it is. Like that's why I don't even go down that sort of rabbit hole where they justify by saying, well, this, because of this, because of this. Nobody's attacking random Russians on the street, right? Because Russia invaded Ukraine, right? But with Jews, right, it happens, and it happened before there was a war, before there was a state of Israel. If anything, a state of Israel, a modern state, our third Jewish Commonwealth, is a reaction to the world hating us, right? Trying to exterminate us, trying to kill us, right? There's a lot at play. But I think at the end of the day, there needs to be some frank conversations about what is anti-Semitism, and we can't pull punches. We got to call it out, and not. And I think a lot of Jews did not call it out because I'm in these progressive social justice spaces because I am a social worker that advocates for marginalized people, right? I still go into prisons. I still work with people in prison. I still work with people in these communities that are marginalized, right? I think without us really having a candid conversation and calling it out and calling out people who are there, why are you avoiding allyship with Jews? Why are you avoiding or why are you ignoring anti-Semitism? Why? That you can't blame it on the war because this happened before the war. And what's happening random Jews on the street has nothing to do with the war, right? They're not taking part in anything. Whether I don't like to get in a discussion point by point. I can, don't get me wrong, and I do, but not with people who just hate Jews. There's no point in getting in that sort of discussion because at the end of the day, right? Do the Jews have the right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland? Do they or do they not? Right. Let's start from there.
Yeah. So obviously you are, an outspoken Zionist. And for listeners that don't follow you on social media, as an aside, just I highly recommend it. Have you noticed differences in how people are treating you, at work and in progressive circles post October 7th? When you walk in and they just saw, your latest Twitter or Instagram post is all about, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Do you sort of get ignored? Are you having those conversations? Are people tiptoeing around you? What is that like?
So yeah, I probably, if anything, people are probably tiptoeing around me. I imagine. I'm just imagining. I don't know. Like people are not having those sort of conversations around me. I won't hesitate to join conversations around me if that happens. But at least in my place of appointment, people are supportive, and the people who might not necessarily agree with everything I have to say. They're just not gonna say to my face. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, right? Like I don't feel like you need to be at work and all your political views or anything like that, or if you know somebody just totally disagrees with your sort of political views. And I say that from a person that I can get along with skinheads and Nazis and all that because I literally did that. I did it with people who hate me and learn like, look, at the end of the day, we can just have cordial relations. So I'm not saying I'm in a work where that's happening, right? And are feeling that, right? I think if all in all, like people are very showing a lot of empathy because, again, I think it's the messenger for a lot of people, especially if you're so beholden to identity, right? People have been more open to hearing my perspective on things because, oh, okay, black guy, he's been through sort of certain situations and comes from he has a layer of credibility of understanding the nuances of DEI, right? And I believe I don't think there's I don't think there's anything wrong with pushing for an atmosphere that is conducive to belonging. Don't think it. It's what they chose to do with that we have an issue with. But yeah, so I think people have approached me in a respectful way, at least at the places of my employment.
Got it. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. Two quick rapid questions, and I'll see if you have any thoughts to conclude on. How did you become this open-minded? I mean, how did you get to this place where you are okay having conversations with, as you just said, skinheads, Nazis, fierce anti-Zionists? I mean, were you like this growing up, or did you sort of develop? Was it something? I mean, for people listening to this that are thinking to themselves, you know, I have trouble talking to somebody who voted differently than me, let alone somebody, we have trouble, if you voted for Kamala Harris, people are, won't talk to Trump voters. And if you voted for Trump, people won't talk to Harris voters. You're talking about, such a wider spectrum so how did you, yeah, how did you get to this point?
Okay, great question. So, I think I've always been a thinker, and I haven't been afraid to argue with people, right? I don't mean like I mean argue about ideas, right? I think it's healthy to argue with ideas as long as you're not doing ad hominem attacks and attacking people personally, right? I also believe, I think it's Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called like The Righteous Mind, and he essentially talks about your personality affects your views. I know a lot of people might believe, well, no, I came to these views through just great reasoning, and that was all that it is. Our personality plays a part. There are conservative types, there are liberal types, right? As soon as I understood that people have a tendency to maybe have particular sort of beliefs, or some people are more open, some people are more closed off, right? You got to start with the understanding that people are coming from the best intentions. You got to assume that. I think that's the general sort of orientation I like to have in life, and I believe that's through robust sort of conversations. Even if you don't agree with the other person, it adds clarity to your own ideas. It allows you to refine your ideas in a way that's going to be more palatable to whoever. Because at the end of the day, what's the point of just holding ideas to yourself if you can't influence others, especially if it's for the good. I guess in prison, it helped me to one, it if I know this person will probably stab me under the right sort of circumstances, I'm not worried so much about what their intentions are anymore, right there, right? If we can have a good conversation, I'm happy about that. We're having a good conversation, right? We don't have to think about what you would do under certain hypothetical situations. And I think too, my shift has changed. I remember there was a point in time when I remember reading a magazine called The Nation that came under my door. That's how we got mail and stuff delivered in prison. And hearing them talking about Israel and people just stealing the land. And I'm like, yeah, they just stole the land, right? I didn't know anything about it. It just made sense to me, right? Like, it just sounded good, right? I didn't know about the history or anything, but I made a conscious effort when I was changing my life around to one, I wanted to follow the truth, even if it took me in uncomfortable places. And I understood too, I'm not saying that there's multiple truths, but there's multiple perceptions of experience that influence people's interaction and understanding of the truth, right? And it's not a black and white thing for a lot of things. And I understood that if you can get to the core, and maybe that's a therapist in me, if you get the core of like what's motivating, right? If you can validate whether it's a fear or anything like that, right? They're going to be more receptive to what you have to hear. And I'll add though, I designed like personal development curriculum and facilitated that while I was in prison. And when I started having conversations with people from the Mexican mafia, from neo-Nazi skinheads and different sort of people, right? I understand they look at a lot of us have been through different sort of traumatic experiences, have not had uh, a lot of the support that we could have, and we responded in the way that our sort of situation kind of was conducive to, right? Understanding that makes me more, I guess, I'm more empathy, not empathy like, oh, if you're a racist, that's a position that I'm totally cool with, but more so, you've had a tough life. That's where you arrived at, right? That's not going to benefit you, right? But let's have a conversation. And I would say is as a therapist, I've had racist clients that were former skinheads, right? I've also worked with former gang members that were out there, doing this, right? And I found that if you are so quick to judge people or say that those people are always going to be and always have those same sort of views that they have in this present moment, you're not going to really get people to be their best selves. You're not going to help people self-actualize. If anything, you might be scratching this sort of itch you have. Maybe it's resentment, maybe it's bitterness or whatever. You might be able to scratch this by lashing out on other people, but you're not you're not what you're doing is not trauma informed. It's not leading to healing, and it's not leading to real dialogue. It's again, it's satisfying your own sort of impulse to attack something that's different.
Yeah, what a great message for people to internalize, especially before Thanksgiving, which is sort of, always culturally the time where this comes to a head. In the last 30 seconds, just because I've been asking everybody this since October 7th, where do you situate yourself on the spectrum of, is the golden age of Jewish life in America coming to an end? Are you, do you think, Jewish life is slowly coming to an end and Jews should start looking to move to Israel? Do you think this will overblow? Are you somewhere in the middle?
Well, I would say, well, I'm a Zionist, and I recently visited Israel earlier this year, right? And I could tell you one thing: Israel was the first place I didn't feel like a minority, meaning I felt like a Jew in a land of Jews. I didn't have to go search out a Jewish community, right? When I hit any state, I visit multiple states, and I'm like, where's the Jewish community at, right? I felt like I was home where I belonged. So I believe that's a great impulse for all Jews to want to move to the land of Jews, right? The land of our people, the one that what we've been connected to for thousands of years. Do I think the so-called golden age in America is over with? I don't know. I know Jews are resilient, so even if it is over with, I imagine we could build it back up again, right? Just it's the ebb and flow of history. They kick us out of a country, then they bring us back. So I don't want to say that's the situation, and I do understand that it's not also in my nature, and so I don't necessarily think it's ideal to simply just run from problems, right? Now, if you're going to go to Eretz Yisrael because you believe that's the best place for you to actualize your Jewish identity and connect with your people and raise a family, then for sure, I agree, go there. If there's a lot of problems going on right here and you feel like you could help the Jewish community here and maybe influence, again, I don't want to say I'm relegated to just helping out Jews. I'm a social worker, so I just don't believe that, right? But if you feel like you can make an impact here and a better impact here, then I mean, I think that's a good reason to stay here for now until whatever compels us to go to Eretz Israel happens.
I love that. And I was, just one more funny aside, you notice they kick us out and bring us back. I was trying to explain to my medieval Jewish history class why the French kicked Jews out, expelled Jews 3 times in the course of 200 years. And the students asked, wait, didn't they just expel Jews 60 years before? And I was like, yeah, but, they realized those were all the doctors, so they were brought back in. Anyway, Dr. Yehudah Pryce, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and early Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you for having me. Always great to have a conversation with you, and have a good Shabbat.